in the synagogue, we read the Torah portion every week, and you have actually with the Torah portion, you have a prophetic section. And this Israeli scholar basically argued that the Torah, the Haftorah readings, the prophetic readings, have been surgically altered to remove any passage that in the New Testament was key for identifying Jesus as the Messiah.
Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. Today we have Seth Postell with us once again. Today he'll be talking with us about the forbidden chapter in the Hebrew Scriptures and what is the leading rabbinic interpretation of this chapter. There is one prophecy that you especially enjoy teaching. Some call it the forbidden chapter. It kind of gets your curiosity sparked. And I've heard some say, well, this section right here is for the Christians. But there it is, right in the Old Testament. So which prophecy is that?
That would be Isaiah 53.
So in Israel, for instance, children learn, I live in Israel, you live in Israel, children learn from the Hebrew Scriptures, yet this chapter is skipped over. Why is it considered the forbidden chapter?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. There was an article that came out several years ago by an Israeli scholar. It wasn't even, it was in a newspaper article where he talked about, in the synagogue, we read the Torah portion every week, and you have actually with the Torah portion, you have a prophetic section. And this Israeli scholar basically argued that the Torah, the Haftorah readings, the prophetic readings, have been surgically altered to remove any passage that in the New Testament was key for identifying Jesus as the Messiah. And he argues that it was intentionally done so that the conversation about Jesus would not be taking place within the synagogues anymore. And so Isaiah 53 is just one of those passages. And in fact, it's one of the most graphic passages about the suffering servant who innocently takes upon himself the iniquities, the sins of others, and dies in their place. And he does so all the while the people for whom he is dying think he's the one that deserves to die, think he's the one that, deserves, that he's despised and he's rejected. And yet this suffering servant becomes the key to the nation's redemption, for their forgiveness of sins.
So here in Israel, and actually in the States, what I've experienced as well, this seems to be the number one chapter in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Tanakh, that people go to show the Messiah or Jesus in the Tanakh. Why is that?
Yeah, because the Jewish concept of the Messiah is typically a Messiah who is, victorious, who establishes a kingdom of peace. He's the son of David. And so one of the things that's constantly being said is if Jesus was truly the Messiah, there'd be peace in the world, and so obviously right. Jesus can't be the Messiah, right? Or, if Jesus was the Messiah, how is it possible that our leaders rejected him? Well, Isaiah 53 explains all of that, because Isaiah 53 explains that, this servant of the Lord will be rejected and despised by his own people. Yet at the same time, he will die, and it describes a death that's clearly violent. He's put to death, he's executed, and Isaiah 53, the vantage point is that the nation realizes, wow, the very one that we rejected is actually the one that came to save us. He was the one that gave his life in our places. And so if you're going to be sharing Jesus with an Israeli, you're going to be sharing Jesus, that would be one of the best places to go, because it's such a clear passage. And in fact, years ago, I was with an Israeli couple, and they, very educated, both of them. He was a successful businessman. She was the principal of a high school. And they knew we were believers. And so she asked me, how is it that you believe in, you kind of mix Christianity and Judaism, and why in the world do you believe this? So I said, listen, I'd like to read a passage. I'm going to read a passage from somewhere, and you have two. You have two tests. You need to tell me where I'm reading from and who it's about. And so I took a Hebrew Bible, didn't tell her, and I read Isaiah 53. And when I finished, she immediately said, "Oh, that's the New Testament. That's Jesus." And I looked at her and I said, "You're half right." Right? And then I held up the Bible I had received, the Hebrew Bible I had received in the IDF, in the Israeli army, so she would know it's a kosher Bible.
Right.
And I said, I just read this from the Hebrew Bible. And she looked at her husband. She said, "Wow, that's Jesus." Right? And so I think just by virtue of the fact that it's a passage that so clearly explains all the gospel passion narratives, that the gospels spend a lot of time on the atoning death of Jesus, and Isaiah 53 explains to us that rationale, the prophecy or the prediction that needed to be fulfilled.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I came to faith a few years back. My wife and I came to faith at the exact same time through a miraculous series of events. And when I got to Isaiah 53, this was just before I fully gave my life to Yeshua, to Jesus. And I was in the gym working out, and I was talking to a pastor friend of mine that we worked out together. And I came across Isaiah 53 and I said, "Have you read it? Have you read Isaiah 53, the forbidden chapter?" And he looks at me like, "Well, yeah, of course." And I was like, "What? I never knew about this. I never knew this." And actually, one of the most miraculous things was that I hadn't even read the New Testament before I came to faith. And that's a whole nother story, because it's a miracle in and of itself how it all happened. But this is about Isaiah 53 and how when I saw that passage, and I think anybody that's watching this should read that, should go right now, open up whatever it is, if it's on your computer, if it's on your an app on your phone, or a Bible that you have at home, Hebrew, English, whatever. Open it up, read Isaiah 53, and you'll see, actually starting with 52, but we'll get into that in a second. Has this prophecy always been considered a messianic prophecy, even before the time of Jesus?
No, that's a really difficult question. And the reason I say it's a difficult question, it was not a, in terms of an early history of interpretation, there's not a lot on it. But what I can say is that you can see Jewish interpretation in the Talmud, for instance, and in other Jewish interpretations did regard this as a prophecy about the Messiah. So, and again, what's interesting, we'll talk about it maybe in a minute, is that there actually is another prophet in the Hebrew Bible that clearly is referring to Isaiah 53 in a way that's very different than the rabbinic interpretation, or the Rashi's interpretation, I should say.
Yeah, well, let's get into that then. There are some rabbinic interpretations about Isaiah 53 that I wanted you to get into. So if you can talk about some of those, that would be helpful.
Well, there's really only one, right?
Okay.
In the sense that the one that changed the conversation was Rashi's. And so just Rashi, if you don't know, he was a rabbi that lived during the period of the First Crusades. And he lived in a horrific time. And Jews were sadly being murdered in the name of Jesus. And he witnessed in Germany, there was a horrific, massacre of the Jewish people. Rashi lived in a time too where the First Crusade, they'd actually conquered the Holy Land. Okay. Why is that significant? Because there was an argument between the synagogue and the church as to who is the true Israel, which is sad that believers would ever argue that, right? And so when the Christians, the Catholic Church basically took the land of Israel, right, that for them was proof that the church had replaced Israel, because they'd received all the land promises. Now they've taken over. So Rashi lived in a time when a lot of Jewish people were in a bit of a crisis of faith. I mean, they were living in horrific conditions underneath Christian Europe. Israel was in the hands of Christians. And so there were Jews that were in a crisis of faith. And so Rashi's Bible commentary, particularly 7 books, were really influenced by his polemics against Jesus. And so he wanted to kind of give a running commentary on scripture that provided fast, easy refutations of the messianic interpretation of the Bible. And many times he did that. The interpretations he provided, they're very sophisticated, but in many cases he would go against what the rabbis before him had said about the Hebrew Bible. And so Isaiah 53, his interpretation, which really has stood the test of time in terms of the Jewish community, the modern Jewish community too, and even modern scholarship, and that is that Isaiah 53 is about the people of Israel. Israel that's suffering for the nations.
Yeah, but this interpretation is problematic when it comes to the justice of God. I mean, what was happening to the people of Israel at the time that this prophecy was written?
Yeah. Well, again, so I would definitely disagree with Rashi on the issue of the justice of God. And I think that one of the things that you need to realize, and I don't think people always realize that, is if Rashi's correct, then the God of Israel is not a very nice God. If Rashi's interpretation is correct, then the God of Israel is a moral monster. Let me explain to you what I mean. Okay? So the way that Rashi's interpretation works is he says that, in Isaiah 52, verse 13, behold, my servant will prosper. Well, who is my servant? Well, look in the larger context, starting from Isaiah 41, Israel constantly is being called my servant Israel, my servant Jacob. He's correct. Okay, he's absolutely correct. But within that larger context, you also have other passages that focus specifically not just on the title, my servant, but the actual role of a servant of the Lord in the plan of God, a role of redemption. And this servant comes and he's intended to redeem the people of Israel. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. So Rashi, let me just explain Rashi. So Rashi would explain that, see, Israel's the servant. That's number one. Number two, in Isaiah 52, verse 15, basically it says that kings will shut their mouths. Kings will be in awe. The nations will be in shock over this servant. Well, Isaiah 53, verses 1 through following is this first person plural confession. We didn't believe, all we like sheep. He suffered for us. And so what Rashi says is, here you go. This is the confession of those Gentiles and kings from 52 verse 15. In other words, 52 verse 15 speaks about the reaction of the nations. And so then Isaiah turns on the recorder, he puts the microphone, and he gets his first podcast, right? And he says, here, now let's hear what the nations have to say. And so it's the nation's confession that Israel, the suffering servant, suffered for their sins. Okay? Now, let me just simply say this. The reason that this Rashi's interpretation is really problematic is what he's basically saying then is that the way that God atones for anti-Semites is through their anti-Semitism. In other words, that Israel is this suffering servant. Israel is this innocent servant. Israel doesn't do anything wrong. And yet God, it says in chapter 53, verse 10, delights to crush his servant. Delights to crush them. How does he crush his servant? He crushes them through the cruelties of the nations. And in the nations being cruel to Israel, God uses their cruelty to atone for them. And so the mission of Israel is to be the scapegoat for the world. And so, yet in the Torah, God promises that if Israel is obedient, right, that he'll bless them for it, number one. Right. God also, whenever there's any actions of anti-Semitism, whenever any nation raises their head up, any adversary comes against Israel, they're judged. Even if God raises them up for judgment, they're judged. But then in Isaiah 53, what Rashi's saying, but in this case, not only are they not judged for treating Israel cruelly, they're forgiven for their sins because of the brutalization of Israel's servant. And so it comes out into a place where it's sickening to think, are you saying, I'm going to be really, how do you say, kitsoni, really
Extreme.
extreme. Are you saying that the gas chambers are being used to atone for the Nazi sins? It's repulsive. It's disgusting. Right. So it's morally reprehensible. So to say that Israel's being brutalized by the will of God to atone for the nations, so that, there's something in us that reacts and says it can't be possible. But at the same time, we're very aware of passages in the Hebrew Bible where an individual Israelite suffers on behalf of his people, unjustly, unfairly suffers, but suffers for their sake. So Joseph would be a great example. Joseph was mistreated by his brothers.
Right.
He was treated terribly, but in the end, God used it to bring life to the people of Israel, and also he brought life to the nations, to the Egyptians. Likewise, Moses was treated very poorly by Israel in the wilderness. When he first came to rescue them, he was rejected. And so, Moses is known as this interceder who prayed for his people and said, God, if you're not going to forgive them, then erase me from the book of life. And so Moses suffered and he was rejected and they quarreled against him, but he lived for the sake of Israel. He did it for their sake. And eventually our people recognized the greatness of Moses. Even at the time we didn't recognize it. And so if you look at Isaiah 53, the individual explanation that we're not talking about the nation's reaction to Israel, but to an individual Israelite who our people reject, but through his rejection results in the forgiveness of our sins, is far more palatable. It's far more acceptable. It's far more consistent with other scriptures. And Rashi's interpretation, what's really interesting too, is that his method of interpretation, called the pshat, it was kind of a way people mistake it with the literal meaning of the Hebrew Bible, but that's not what pshat does. The pshat is the simplest refutation of the Christian interpretation. That's what pshat does. And so Rashi's looking for details within the immediate context to show that this passage has to be Israel. The problem is that Rashi does not address the larger context, which is Isaiah 40 through 55, which scholars have described as Isaiah's new Exodus. He describes the future redemption in the light of Exodus, of the first Exodus. And so Isaiah is constantly describing the future as another Exodus. Now, why is that important? Well, who was the most significant figure other than God in Israel's Exodus out of Egypt? Moses. And there's a close relationship between Moses and the people. So, for instance, Moses is rescued from drowning in the water in the beginning of the story, just like Israel, right? Moses meets God at Mount Sinai first in the burning bush, so that later Israel will meet God at burning Mount Sinai. And so there's a close association. And so likewise, if you read about the servant of the Lord passages in Isaiah 50 through 55, you see, yes, the nation is called the servant of the Lord as a title, but amidst the people, you have one servant who actually represents them perfectly. He's a royal servant, like a king. He's a priestly servant. He intercedes. He's a prophetic. He's got a prophetic ministry. And by the way, one of the key aspects of being a prophet in Israel is to be rejected. That's a key criterion to, are you really a prophet? How do we know? Does Israel receive you or reject you at first? If you're rejected, you're a prophet, right? And so this picture of one like Moses who brings in a new redemption, a new Exodus. And so the Messianic interpretation makes sense of the larger context, that the Messiah, the servant, is like a new Moses. Mm-hmm. And it also doesn't go against the justice of God.
Well, I'm not saying this myself, but I've heard some people say, well, that new servant could be, the prophet like Moses could be Joshua coming right after him. And what are the arguments against that?
Well, I mean, that's obviously not reading the context, because Isaiah 50 through 55 and the whole second half of the book of Isaiah, 40 through 66, again, we talk about promises for the future. We're not just talking about references to the past. So in the context of Isaiah 40 through 55 or 40 through 66, Isaiah is kind of fleshing out some of the earlier promises in the first half of the book, that one day all nations will come and not march against Jerusalem, but march up to Jerusalem, not to attack them with weapons, but to march up with those weapons to beat them into plowshares. And so the whole context of 40 through 55 of Isaiah is dealing with future. It's a future redemption. It's not something that has taken place in the past. So Joshua, that whole interpretation would be ridiculous, because it doesn't fit the context.
Stay tuned for our next video with Seth Postell, where we'll be discussing the only candidate that can be considered the Messiah and why. Jews for Jesus is a nonprofit organization that exists to support you as you explore Jewish life with faith in Jesus. We facilitate Jewish community all around the world as we provide spiritual care and local services. We also raise awareness about the fact that for thousands of years, there have been Jewish people like us who have embraced Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. And even though he was possibly the most famous Jewish person in all of history, there are still many Jewish people who have never had the chance to be exposed to the teachings of Jesus. And that's something we seek to change. For more information, to chat with us live, and to sign up for our newsletter, check us out at jewsforjesus.org or on social media at Facebook and Instagram.